Have you ever tried to imagine a world wrapped in silence? A world where every voice you spoke ended right at the edge of the room? It sounds strange, doesn't it? But once, long before our technology connected hearts and homes, words were like butterflies. They fluttered close by, beautiful and meaningful, but they never flew very far. The world spoke softly then. Instead of echoes, there were letters. And every single message carried with it the heavy, patient weight of distance. Imagine this. Somewhere, a mother whispers goodbye to a child before a long, uncertain journey. Her words, full of love and worry, take weeks to arrive on a piece of paper. And somewhere else, a lover waits by a window, reading the same letter over and over again, because that piece of paper was the only voice they could hold in their hands. The earth seemed to turn much more slowly in those days. Horses pulled carts along cobblestone roads, their hooves making a steady rhythm. Lamps flickered on wooden tables, casting long, dancing shadows. And along the roads, telegraph wires hummed, but not with voices. They hummed with dots and dashes of cold, coded language. Messages could travel, yes, but they had no warmth, no tone, no breath. The world had learned to write across distances, but it had not yet learned how to speak beyond sight. And yet, somewhere in that profound silence, the seeds of a miracle were just waiting to bloom. In a small, cluttered workshop in Boston, filled with tangled wires and strange wooden boxes, a young inventor sat listening, not to words, but to the quiet hum of possibility. His name was Alexander Graham Bell. He was a teacher of the deaf, a man who understood the secret language of vibration and air better than almost anyone. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. Could sound be caught? Could a voice, a human voice, travel through a wire just like light travels through glass? The thought seemed impossible, a wild fantasy, but it wouldn't leave him alone. Each morning, sunlight would creep across his desk, glinting off the metal coils and copper plates scattered everywhere. Bell would run his fingers along the wires as if they were the strings of a violin, wondering which note, might finally carry a human tone. He wasn't alone in this quiet, obsessive pursuit. Beside him worked Thomas Watson, loyal, curious. His hands were steady and sure, even when experiment after experiment failed. Together, they soldered, adjusted, and dreamed. Their little workshop was alive, not with noise, but with the constant ticking of time and the steady, hopeful heartbeat of invention. Outside, the city of Boston bustled with life. The shouts of street criers, the rumble of carriages, the sound of laughter, it all faded away at their door. Inside, these two men lived in a world of whispers and hums. They spoke of sound as if it were a living thing. They truly believed that every vibration carried a message, that the human voice wasn't just air, it was energy, something that could travel, unseen, through the right channel. For them, each failed test wasn't a defeat. It was just another clue, another secret written in silence, pointing them in a new direction. Late into the night, the lamps would flicker low, casting a warm glow on their tired faces. Bell's eyes would grow weary, but his mind refused to rest. He felt he could almost hear something within the copper, a distant, faint echo trying to answer him. He'd adjust a magnet, rewire a coil, speak softly into a strange-looking mouthpiece, and then wait. And one night, it happened. A faint vibration trembled through the air. It was too soft to be a voice, but it was enough to make him gasp. For one brief, electrifying second, the silence spoke back. He knew then he was close. The dream that had once lived only in his imagination was finally starting to take a physical form. He built a new transmitter that buzzed when he spoke into it. Watson, standing across the room, leaned in close to a receiver. His ear pressed against it. He heard faint, scratchy sounds. The two men exchanged a look, their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken hope. If sound could travel this far, across a single room, then maybe it could travel farther. Across streets, across cities, maybe even across time itself. Days turned into nights, and nights bled back into days. The workshop became a symphony of effort. The tap-tap-tap of hammers, the low hum of wires, and the sound of Bell muttering calculations under his breath. He would often pause and think of his mother, who lived in a quiet world where words were felt more than they were heard. That memory was his fuel. It pushed him forward. He wanted to build a world where silence no longer separated hearts. One evening, a storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled outside, and rain pattered against the window panes. Bell stood near his table, his face illuminated by the small, flickering flame of an oil lamp. Watson was on the other side of the apparatus, adjusting the receiver, while Bell fine-tuned the circuit. The air in the room was thick with the smell of metal and ozone. For a moment, they both stopped, just listening. The sound of the rain became part of the rhythm of their experiment, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first human voice to cross the wire. He spoke softly into the mouthpiece, testing, measuring somewhere in the tangled lines of copper. A response trembled back. It was faint, but it was real. Bell's pulse quickened. He looked at Watson, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Watson smiled, a little uncertain, but he nodded. The room fell silent again, filled with the heavy, electric sound of anticipation. The impossible was now just a breath away. Outside, the world was completely unaware. Children slept soundly in their warm beds. Lovers walked under shared umbrellas. Postmen carried their satchels of letters, each one sealed with wax. No one knew that inside a modest room in Boston, humanity was about to cross an invisible bridge. The hum of the wires grew faint, then strong again. The idea was alive, now fragile, electric, and unstoppable. Bell leaned against his workbench, exhausted but exhilarated. He closed his eyes and let his imagination fly. He saw voices soaring across oceans, friends speaking to each other without delay, a word of comfort reaching someone far away in an instant. He smiled at the thought. The silence wouldn't last much longer. Somewhere, deep within those copper lines, sound was finally waiting to be free. He whispered to himself, a promise to the future. One day, voices will travel faster than light through darkness. Watson didn't answer. He was too focused, too lost in the sound of progress. The two men were not just building a machine. They were building a bridge across time itself. And that night, as the last candle flickered out and the rain softened to a gentle mist, Bell stepped outside. The city lay quiet, its lanterns glowing like scattered stars on the ground. He looked up at the vast night sky, whispering a question that only he could hear. What if sound could live forever? And it felt as though the wind answered him gently, carrying the faint, hopeful echo of tomorrow. In that very moment, the great silence of the world began to change. It didn't break with a clap of thunder or a sudden shout. It began with a whisper, a single whisper that would grow and travel, and one day connect every single heart under the same sky. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more journeys into the moments that changed our world. We'll see you next time. Have you ever heard something faint, almost too soft for the ear, and known it was the beginning of something extraordinary? For Alexander Graham Bell, that whisper wasn't just a sound. It was the future calling his name. The morning after a long, heavy night of rain, Bell returned to his workshop with a restless heart. The air still smelled faintly of damp earth, metal, and something else, hope. His partner, Thomas Watson, was already there, wiping condensation from the window pane. His sleeves were rolled up, his eyes bright with anticipation. The two men exchanged a silent nod, the kind of look that passes between people on the verge of greatness. It was a look that said, today could be the day. The room was alive, not with noise, but with a crackling tension, a quiet, humming excitement. Wires snaked across the floorboards like the roots of a strange new tree, searching for fertile ground. On the wooden workbench, tiny brass screws and delicate copper coils gleamed in the morning sunlight. Bell, his hands surprisingly steady, carefully adjusted the transmitter. His fingers weren't trembling from fear, but from the breathtaking closeness of discovery. In this delicate dance, every sound mattered, each hum, each faint buzz from the equipment. The very air felt electric, charged with possibility. For days, they had been endlessly refining the design. Bell was obsessed with a single idea. The secret lay in making the diaphragm a thin sheet of metal vibrate, just enough to carry the complex waves of sound without distortion. He bent closer, his warm breath fogging the polished brass surface. He spoke a few words, low and careful, into the mouthpiece. Across the room, Watson leaned in, pressing the receiver to his ear, listening with every fiber of his being. Nothing but a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the device. Bell let out a long sigh, but then a soft smile touched his lips. In this quest, even failure had begun to sound like progress. It was a clue, a breadcrumb on the path forward. Outside the workshop window, spring was in full bloom. The city of Boston pulsed with life, the rhythmic clip-clop of carriage wheels on cobblestone, the distant chatter of vendors and pedestrians. Yet, inside that small, cluttered room, the rest of the world seemed a million miles away. These two men had built their own private universe, one constructed from sound and silence, from daring guesses and small, unexpected miracles. There were moments of levity. They would laugh at their own exhaustion, their faces smudged with oil and soot, looking more like mechanics than world-changing inventors. Then there were hours of intense, unbroken silence, where the only communication was the shared focus on listening for whispers in the wire. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Bell took a deep, steadying breath. "Watson," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let's make one more adjustment." He tightened a screw here, repositioned a coil there, each movement precise and deliberate. He placed his ear near the mouthpiece, listening to the machine's inner workings. Across the room, Watson stood ready, a pillar of patience and unwavering support. Bell spoke softly, his voice shaking just a little, not with doubt, but with the immense weight of the moment. "Do you hear me now?" A faint vibration answered, then a soft, staticky crackle, and then something more. A tone. It was fragile, ethereal, but it was unmistakable. Watson's eyes widened in disbelief. He pressed his ear closer to the receiver, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Say it again," he whispered, his own voice tight with emotion. Bell repeated the words, his voice a little louder this time, filled with a rising tide of excitement. The sound broke through the silence, shimmered for a brilliant, impossible moment, and then vanished again into the ether. But for that one brief, magical instant, the wire had lived. It had carried a human sound. It wasn't yet speech, not a clear voice. It was only a ghost of a sound, a fleeting shadow of what could be. Yet that whisper was more than enough. It was the spark that reignited their belief, turning it into a roaring fire. They worked late into the night again, chasing that perfect, elusive tone through the labyrinth of wires and magnets. Bell adjusted the delicate diaphragm with a surgeon's touch. Watson patiently rewound coils of copper wire. Both men were driven by the strange, haunting beauty of those half-heard voices from the machine. The workshop glowed with lamplight, the air thick with the scent of hot metal and pure, unyielding determination. At one point, the tension in the room grew heavy, the weight of their repeated failures pressing down. Watson wiped his brow, his shoulders slumping slightly. "What if it can't be done, Mr. Bell?" he murmured, the question hanging in the quiet air. Bell looked up from his tools, his eyes clear and steady. "Then we will make it possible," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of patience, of centuries of dreamers and innovators who had dared to believe in the impossible before him. The next morning, he arrived before sunrise. The world outside was still, wrapped in a pre-dawn silence, broken only by the first tentative chirps of birds. He set the receiver carefully in its place, adjusted the transmitter one more time, and then whispered to the coiled wires as if they were living things that could understand him. "Carry my voice," he pleaded softly. "Just once. Let it travel." He pressed his lips close to the mouthpiece, breathed a single word into the device, and waited, his body perfectly still. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence stretched. Then, from across the room, a faint echo answered back, like a breath returning to its source. It was his own word, clear and present. Watson entered just then, startled to see Bell standing frozen in the middle of the room. his eyes wide and wet with disbelief. "It spoke," Bell whispered, his voice trembling. The wire spoke. Watson smiled, a broad, knowing grin spreading across his face. He hadn't heard it himself, but he knew. He could see it in Bell's expressions. Something sacred had just happened. For the rest of that week, they tested endlessly. It was a maddening, exhilarating process. Sometimes the sound came through with startling clarity. Other times it disappeared entirely, leaving them in frustrating silence. The wire seemed alive, temperamental, like a wild spirit that had to be coaxed and tamed. Bell began to talk to it, to encourage it like a friend. "You can do this," he would murmur, his hand resting on the wooden casing. "Just listen." Watson laughed softly at first, but soon he began to believe it too. Every success, every failure, became a note in a growing, complex melody. The workshop had transformed. It no longer felt like just a place of tools and metal, but a place of awakening. The first complete sentence had not yet been spoken, but it was close, so close you felt as if the air itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Outside, the world carried on as usual. People bought bread from the baker. Children chased hoops down the street, and telegraphs clattered away with the day's news. No one knew that in a small room on a quiet street, two men were coaxing the future out of silence. But if anyone had paused outside their window and listened closely, they might have heard it, the faint, electric hum of destiny, the wire trembling softly with the promise of speech. That night, Bell leaned back in his chair, utterly exhausted but deeply content. "It's not ready yet," Watson said, stating the obvious. Bell smiled, a tired but triumphant light in his eyes. "No," he replied, "but it's listening now." And for them, that was everything. As they put out the lamps, the copper wires shimmered faintly in the darkness, like veins of light tracing a path to a new world. Somewhere within those metallic strands, the first human voice to travel across a distance waited, impatient, eager, and ready to make the call that would echo across time. The age of silence was almost over. The whisper had begun to take shape. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you were inspired by the story of this incredible invention, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the moments that changed our world. See you next time. Have you ever felt a single moment stretch so long it feels like time itself is holding its breath? Imagine a still morning, sunlight spilling softly across a cluttered workbench in Boston. The air inside the workshop hums faintly with anticipation. Wires curl like sleeping snakes. A brass transmitter gleams in the quiet light. For weeks, experiments had teased them, sounds half heard, voices almost formed. But today felt different. There was something alive in the silence, something waiting to be born. This was the world of Alexander Graham Bell and his assistant, Thomas Watson. Bell's fingers moved quickly, tightening screws, checking the tension of wires, his face a canvas of exhaustion and hope. Watson watched him with a quiet patience, the kind that grows only between two people who have dreamed the same dream for far too long. They didn't need to speak much. Their conversation had become the rhythm of their movements, the shared flicker of their eyes. Bell adjusted the transmitter one last time. He took a deep breath, and his voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Watson, let's try once more." Watson nodded and positioned himself near the receiver in the adjoining room. The workshop smelled of oil and ozone, the scent of creation. The moment felt endless, suspended perfectly between failure and miracle. Bell leaned close to the mouthpiece. "Mr. Watson," he called carefully, his voice trembling slightly. "Come, here, I want to see you." The words left his lips and entered the wire like lightning finding its path. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Just a familiar, frustrating silence. Then, across the room, through that thin thread of copper, Watson froze. His eyes widened. He heard it. Not a buzz, not a crackle, not a hum, but a voice. A clear, human voice. He ran into the room, breathless, his eyes shining with disbelief and triumph. "Mr. Bell, I heard you. I heard every word." The air between them seemed to shimmer, heavy with the incredible weight of what had just happened. Bell lowered his head, his hand trembling as it rested over the transmitter. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he looked up and smiled a quiet, almost disbelieving smile. They had done it. They had actually done it. In that small, quiet Boston workshop, the world had just changed forever. The first telephone call wasn't a grand public spectacle. There were no crowds, no booming announcements, no flashbulbs popping. It was just two men, surrounded by wires and the ghosts of their past failures, suddenly realizing they had bridged the gap. They had connected sound and electricity, breath and current, the human heart and the unfeeling machine. Bell finally sat down, staring at the strange instrument as if it were a living thing. Watson let out a soft laugh, still trying to catch his breath. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked, the wonder still fresh in his voice. Bell nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his own voice low with awe. "It means that distance just became smaller." For a while, they just sat there in silence, listening to the faint hum of the wire. It was as if their invention itself was breathing, alive in the room with them. Bell reached out and touched a transmitter gently, like a father touching the hand of his newborn child. Outside, the world carried on, completely unaware. A street vendor shouted his morning prizes. The hooves of horses clattered on the cobblestones. Children chased a hoop down the road. None of them knew that inside that small building, the sound of a human voice had just traveled through copper and current for the very first time in history. As the day unfolded, Bell and Watson tested the device again and again. Each call was clearer than the last. Their words passed through metal as if it were air, carrying not just sound, but tone, warmth, even laughter. It was more than just sound, it was presence. Bell had a profound realization. This wasn't just an invention of wires and magnets. It was an invention of connection. It made the invisible visible. It gave a voice to silence. By evening, pure exhaustion began to replace the raw excitement. As Watson cleaned the tools, Bell sat quietly, staring at the simple wooden box that had just rewritten human history. The first words were ordinary. Bell murmured to himself, "But what they carry is not." His thoughts drifted to his deaf mother, to how sound and the lack of IT had shaped his entire life. It was the silence that had driven him to listen harder than most people ever do. And now, he had given the entire world a new way to listen. He stepped outside into the cool night air. The city glowed faintly with lamplight, the stars dim but steady above. From open windows, he could hear the drift of human life, people talking, laughing, singing. Soon, he thought, those very same voices would travel through wires, crossing streets, then cities, then entire countries. The night itself seemed to hum with an invisible, electric energy. Watson joined him, and they stood there for a long while without speaking. The quiet felt different now. It was no longer empty, but full of promise. Somewhere inside the locked workshop, their invention rested, its wires coiled softly like veins, ready to carry the heartbeat of human speech. Bell looked up at the stars and whispered, almost to himself, "We just taught the world to speak to itself." Watson smiled in the darkness. "And one day," he added, "they'll speak across oceans." Bell nodded slowly, the idea sinking in. Across oceans, and maybe even beyond. That night, the two men locked up their workshop, completely unaware that their names would soon be woven into the fabric of every voice that ever traveled down a wire. The telephone would grow, change, and evolve in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. But that first call, that trembling, hopeful whisper of "Come here, I want to see you," would never fade. It would echo through generations, across continents, and through time itself. Every conversation, every business deal, every "I love you" whispered across the miles would carry a tiny fragment of that one miraculous moment in a Boston workshop. Though the world slept that night, blissfully unaware, the very air we breathe had already changed. It carried memory now. It carried voice. The profound silence that had wrapped humanity for centuries had finally been broken by a whisper that would never, ever be forgotten. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more incredible moments from history, Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a video. I'll see you in the next one. Morning light slips quietly through the curtains of the workshop. The tools are still scattered from the day before, but everything feels different now. The air has changed. It hums faintly with a secret that can no longer be contained. Bell wakes early, his mind still echoing with the sound of his own voice traveling through the wire. He can shake the feeling that the world has tilted slightly overnight, that something invisible has shifted forever. Watson arrives soon after, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. They don't need to speak. Their eyes say everything. There is pride, disbelief, and a quiet question. What happens now? Bell smiles faintly. Now, he says, we make sure the world can hear. They begin testing again, not for themselves this time, but for others. Bell adjusts the coils. Watson notes every faint crackle and buzz. Each improvement brings clarity. Each failure teaches patience. The wire no longer feels like simple metal, it feels alive, as though it carries emotion along with sound. By midday, curious faces begin to gather at the door. Neighbors, apprentices, strangers who have heard rumors of a talking wire. Bell hesitates. A part of him wants to keep the magic private, to protect it from disbelief. But he knows inventions, like light, are not meant to stay hidden. So he invites them in. The room fills with whispers and skeptical smiles. Watson stands near the receiver, while Bell lifts the transmitter and speaks gently. Good morning. The voice leaps through the wire and into Watson's ear. He repeats the words aloud, and gasps fill the air. Some laugh in surprise, others simply stare in awe. Bell watches the moment when wonder overtakes doubt, a look that spreads slowly from face to face, like dawn breaking over the horizon. The whisper has become a voice, and that voice is beginning to travel. Soon, word reaches far beyond the workshop. Scientists, investors, and even journalists come knocking. Some are inspired, others deeply suspicious. Electric sound. They call it a trick of wires. Bell welcomes them all. He demonstrates tirelessly, his calm voice flowing through the strange wooden box that bridges silence and speech. One reporter, after hearing the transmission for himself, wrote, "It is as if a ghost speaks from the air itself." Bell smiles when he reads it. Perhaps, in a way, it's true. The telephone is a kind of spirit, invisible, intimate, and eternal. Evenings in the workshop become quieter. After everyone has gone, Bell often sits by the window, watching the lamplight shimmer in the glass. He thinks of his mother, again of how she had lived in silence. He wishes she could hear him now, could listen to the voice that had finally crossed space. He realizes that every success carries a trace of longing, a quiet reminder that invention often begins with what we miss most. Watson notices his quiet moods. "You've given the world your voice," he says one night, trying to lift his friend's spirits. Bell smiles softly. "No," he whispers, "I've only given it a way to listen." Days turn into weeks, and the telephone begins its slow journey outward, from Boston to New York, and from New York to the distant coasts. Curious minds begin testing its reach. The first public demonstrations draw huge crowds. Men in fine hats and women in lace gloves lean in close, their faces a mixture of fear and excitement. Hearing distant speech travel through invisible lines. Children laugh, calling out to unseen voices, delighted by the magic of it all. The world, once separated by miles of earth and ocean, is beginning to draw closer, word by word, breath by breath. And yet, through all the praise and attention, Bell remains humble. During one of his lectures, he tells the audience, "It's not my voice that matters, but the connection it creates." Those who heard him understood that this was more than just an invention, was empathy, made electric. As spring arrives, the telephone wires begin to climb the streets. Delicate threads stretching between newly erected poles. They look like spiderwebs at sunrise, catching the first light, carrying the lifeblood of a new era. People on their way to work pause beneath them, looking up, wondering what words might be passing over their heads. The city itself begins to hum faintly with the sound of thousands of unseen conversations. In that hum, Bell hears more than just success. He hears the promise of humanity, learning to reach out across any distance. He knows with absolute certainty that the world will never be the same again. And though the future still waits beyond the horizon, he feels something powerful taking root. Connection has become part of the air itself. Late one evening, as the city falls quiet, Bell and Watson stand beneath those new wires. The street lamps glow softly, and above them, the lines cross the night sky like notes on an endless sheet of music. "Listen," Bell says, his voice barely a whisper. Watson tilts his head, confused. "To what?" Bell smiles. "To the sound of people discovering each other." And as the stars shimmer over the whispering wires, the two men feel what every dreamer feels after the impossible becomes real, the profound peace of knowing that their work had given the world a new voice, one that would never fade. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you were inspired by Bell's story of connection, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the ideas that changed our world. Until next time, stay curious. In an age where the world learned to speak through copper wires, when cities hummed with the newfound magic of connection, one man's gaze was already fixed on the future. His name was Alexander Graham Bell. The telephone, his own miraculous invention, had conquered distance, but Bell dreamed of something more. He dreamed of freedom. He envisioned a world where sound could travel without strings, without boundaries, carried on the very air we breathe. Walking the quiet streets at dusk, Bell would look up at the telephone lines, crisscrossing the sky like the staves of some grand, silent orchestra. He imagined invisible notes floating between them, whispers of a new era. If voices can travel through metal, he'd often muse to his trusted assistant, Thomas Watson. Perhaps one day, they will travel through the air. Watson would laugh. A warm, familiar sound. "You mean without wires?" he'd ask, a smile playing on his lips. Bell would nod, his eyes alight with a familiar fire. Yes, sound carried by invisible waves, maybe even light itself, could carry our words. Watson would just shake his head softly. "Another one of your dreams, Mr. Bell." But Bell knew the truth. Every invention begins that way, my friend. To many, the idea was pure fantasy. Even esteemed scientists dismissed it outright. Air cannot hold speech, they scoffed. The signal would vanish into nothing. But Bell was no stranger to skepticism. He remembered the sneers, the disbelief that greeted his first successful telephone call. The world now buzzed with his impossible creation, a constant reminder that the limits of today are often the breakthroughs of tomorrow. He knew better than to bow to doubt. So, in the quiet solitude of his workshop, away from the prying eyes of the world, Bell began to experiment. He sketched out strange and wonderful devices, machines designed not just to transmit sound, but to transform it into light. He called it the photophone. This wasn't a project born of ambition or a desire for more fame. It was driven by the same raw, unyielding curiosity that had fascinated him since he was a boy watching his mother, who was deaf, form silent songs with her lips. His ultimate goal was to free the human voice completely, to give it wings and let it fly. In a small room, filled with the gentle dance of dust motes in sunbeams, Bell and Watson worked tirelessly. Their laboratory was a collage of mirrors, lenses, and prisms, all aimed at capturing and directing rays of light that flickered like liquid silver. They failed, again and again. The process was frustrating, the progress incremental, but they persisted. Then, one sun-drenched afternoon, it happened. The light pouring through the window was perfect. Bell carefully aimed a narrow, focused beam of sunlight toward a receiver positioned several hundred feet away. He leaned into the transmitter, his heart pounding, and spoke softly. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then it came. Faint, trembling, almost ghostly, but unmistakable. It was his own voice, carried not by wire, not by any physical medium, but on a simple beam of light. Watson, who had been listening intently at the receiver, froze. He looked back at Bell, his eyes wide with astonishment. "It worked," he whispered, the words barely audible. A look of quiet, profound triumph washed over Bell's face. "No wire," he said, his own voice a breathy whisper. "Just air and light." The photophone was, by any practical measure, a failure. It was fragile, temperamental, and easily interrupted by a passing cloud, a gust of wind, or even a puff of smoke. But Bell didn't care about its commercial viability. What mattered was the principle. What mattered was the truth it had revealed, that sound could travel through light, that communication could, one day, be truly limitless. The dream of wireless speech was no longer just a dream. It was a proven possibility. He presented his findings to scholars and fellow inventors, his excitement palpable. But most failed to grasp the revolutionary significance of what he had achieved. Too delicate, they said. Too impractical. Too uncertain. Bell would simply smile, a knowing, patient smile. So was the telephone. Once, the years rolled on, and while the photophone faded into a historical footnote, the dream it had sparked did not. It found fertile ground in the minds of a new generation of inventors, young men with restless hearts and eyes full of fire. One of them was a quiet, determined Italian boy named Guglielmo Marconi. He had read about Bell's experiments with light, and it ignited a new idea in his mind. What if the carrier wasn't light, but something else? An invisible force that filled the very air itself. Radio waves. Bell, now a celebrated elder statesman of science, watched from afar as Marconi's dream took flight. He felt no jealousy, only a shared sense of purpose. When the news finally came in 1901 that Marconi's wireless signal had successfully crossed the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, Bell was in his study. He calmly set the newspaper down on his desk, a soft smile gracing his lips. He whispered to the empty room, "He did it. The voice has learned to fly." A profound sense of pride filled his chest, not for himself, but for the journey of the idea. It was the joy of a parent watching their child grow up and achieve things they could only imagine. His dream had been reborn, stronger and more powerful, in the hands of another. That night, Bell stood outside under a brilliant, star-filled sky. He knew that somewhere, high above him, invisible waves were leaping between towers, crossing continents and oceans, carrying human words at speeds that wires could never hope to match. The air itself, once a barrier, had become a boundless sea of sound. He thought back to that very first telephone call, to his own trembling voice, calling out to Watson in the next room. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." That same spark, that same fundamental human desire to connect, was still alive, but now it was soaring through the night sky. The world was changing at a dizzying pace. Cities glowed brighter with electric light. Great steel towers began to rise where simple wooden poles had once stood. The hum of civilization grew into a roar, the thunder of trains, the frantic clicking of telegraphs, the constant ringing of telephones, and now, the silent, invisible ripple of voices through the ether. Humanity was beginning to master the unseen forces of the universe. Bell's hair had long since turned silver, but the fire of his curiosity burned as brightly as ever. When young, aspiring engineers would visit his lab, he would often share his deepest philosophy. Invention, he would tell them, his eyes twinkling, is not about building machines. It's about building bridges. Bridges between silence and sound, between loneliness and understanding, between one human heart and another. They would listen, wide-eyed, perhaps not fully realizing they were in the presence of a man who had fundamentally altered the rhythm of human life forever. As the decades passed, the telephone grew smaller, faster, and more powerful. Voices that once struggled to be heard down a heavy, crackling line now leaped freely between cities and across nations. Wireless signals conquered mountains, spanned seas, and soared into the skies. From the humble hum of Bell's first workshop had grown the great, magnificent chorus of the modern world. One cool evening, an elderly Alexander Graham Bell sat by the sea near his home in Nova Scotia. Gulls circled lazily above the churning water. On the wind, he could hear the faint, familiar murmur of telegraph poles, the distant ring of bells, and he could feel, in his very bones, the pulse of countless radio waves flowing through the air all around him. He closed his eyes and smiled. The world was speaking. not in one voice, but in millions, all at once, a symphony of connection. And though the years had carried him far from that first, trembling whisper on a beam of light, he could still feel its echo deep inside him. He looked out at the waves, a soft, contented look on his face. "We thought we were just making machines," he said quietly, as if speaking to the ocean itself. "But all along, we were teaching humanity how to listen." The sky deepened to a rich indigo, and far above, unseen signals shimmered through the stars, like music from another realm. Somewhere, a voice crossed the air, not bound by wire, not limited by distance, the voice of a world that had finally, truly, learned to hear itself. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the mind of a true visionary. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the history of innovation. We'll see you next time. The world had grown louder. Cities pulsed with voices that crossed not only streets but entire continents. Towers rose where once stood simple wooden poles, and the very air itself shimmered with invisible words. The invention that began as a whisper between two men had become the heartbeat of civilization. Yet, in the midst of all that sound, Alexander Graham Bell found himself listening for something quieter, the echo of where it all began. He walked slower now, his hair a shock of silver white, his step marked by time, but not by weariness. He still carried notebooks everywhere, filled with sketches and thoughts, pieces of wonder that refused to fade. "Sound never truly dies," he once told a student. "It travels, fades, and hides, but it never vanishes. It waits for us to listen again." Bell spent more and more of his days in his home by the water, gazing out at the vast Atlantic, where voices now crossed freely in the form of signals and code. Ships at sea no longer felt utterly alone. Their captains could call for help across miles of dark, unforgiving water. Empires spoke to each other through cables laid across the ocean floor. Lovers whispered goodnight across continents. The world had become smaller, yet more intimately connected than anyone could have ever imagined. Sometimes, as the evening sun melted into the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water, Bell would take one of his earliest telephones from its wooden shelf. The brass still shone faintly, though time and countless hands had softened its edges. He would run his fingers across its cool surface and smile, a private, knowing smile. "You carried the first voice," he would whisper to the inanimate object, "and it still hasn't stopped speaking." His old friend and assistant, Watson, visited him often in those later years. They would sit together on the porch, listening to the wind hum through the trees, a sound that reminded them of the early days back in the workshop when the hum of a single wire had been their constant, hopeful music. "Can you believe it, Watson?" Bell said once, his eyes fixed on a distant radio tower, blinking its red light against the deepening dusk. "Our little machine. It's become the world's heartbeat." Watson chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "And to think it all started because you spilled acid on your trousers." They both laughed softly, the sound carrying out across the sea, like a memory finally set free. But as their laughter faded, a peaceful silence filled the air. Bell looked out at the waves, watching them endlessly roll and break. "Do you ever wonder," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "if every word we ever spoke is still out there? Every hello, every goodbye just floating through time, like echoes waiting to be found." Watson smiled gently, understanding the poetry in his friend's scientific mind. "If that's true, then the first words you ever spoke through it are still ringing somewhere. Mr. Watson, come here. Maybe they never stopped." Bell closed his eyes and just listened. In that moment, the distant hiss of the waves became the static of time itself, the soft, continuous hum of every voice ever spoken, layered together like a grand, unplanned symphony. He imagined the voices of children laughing with delight through the receiver, of lovers whispering secrets goodnight, of families separated by oceans, their voices reuniting them across the miles. Every sound, every connection, every shared heartbeat, carried forward by his dream. The telephone had become more than a tool. It was a memory machine, a keeper of connection. And even then, It was beginning to evolve again. Across the ocean, brilliant engineers were turning sound into electrical pulses, laying the groundwork for what would one day become digital communication. Voices would soon become numbers, numbers would become code, and even in silence, humanity would continue to speak. Bell marveled at the thought that someday, people might not need to hold a wire, or even see a machine. Voices might live inside the air itself, inside light, inside invisible waves that spanned the entire globe. He could almost see it in his mind's eye. People carrying small, elegant instruments in their pockets, speaking to anyone, anywhere in the world, with impossible ease. It sounded like pure magic, but Bell knew better. Every miracle begins as a simple idea whispered into the dark. One evening, as twilight deepened into night, a young journalist came to interview him. She was bright-eyed and full of questions. "Mr. Bell," she asked, "when you made that very first telephone call, did you ever imagine it would lead to all of this?" Bell smiled, a soft, wistful expression on his face. "No," he said. "I only imagined a world where no one would feel alone." The words hung in the air like a lullaby. After she left, he sat in the comfortable silence for a long time. The sea murmured against the shore, and in the faint, rhythmic hum of the evening breeze, he could almost hear them distant conversations, carried on invisible tides. The world was speaking to itself, a constant, never-ceasing dialogue. As night fully settled, Bell lit a lamp and opened one of his old journals. The handwriting on the page was shaky now, the ink faded by the years. At the top of one page, he had written a personal mission statement long ago. To bridge the silence between souls, that is the true purpose of invention. He smiled, closed the book, and looked up toward the sky. Above him, the stars shimmered faintly, connected by invisible waves of light and gravity. And somewhere out there, in the vast darkness, voices were crossing paths, messages from ships at sea, from towering cities, from human hearts reaching out to one another. Humanity had filled the night with its whispers, and those whispers had become an endless chorus. Bell leaned back in his chair, the reflection of the stars in his eyes. "We gave the world a voice," he murmured to the night, "and is still learning how to sing." The sea answered softly, its waves folding upon themselves in a gentle, rhythmic applause. And as he drifted into quiet thought, the very air around him seemed to pulse with faint echoes, the same electric heartbeat that had started in a small workshop decades ago, still whispering its message of connection across time. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more stories about the ideas and people who shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one. The years folded gently into twilight. The century was turning, the old world giving way to a new one, shimmering with light, motion, and sound. Alexander Graham Bell watched from the edge of that transition, half in memory, half in wonder. The invention that had begun with trembling hands and a whispered call was becoming the invisible language of the modern age. He was older now, his hair as white as seafoam, but his eyes still held that bright spark of curiosity. The telephone lines stretched from his home endlessly toward the horizon, a vast network carrying countless voices he would never know. Sometimes, he would pause on his porch and close his eyes, just listening to the faint electric hum in the distance. It wasn't silence. It was life, moving, inside. His desk was a beautiful chaos of creation, coils of copper, glass lenses, notes written in faded ink. Among them lay a small wooden telephone, the very same one that had carried his first words to his assistant, Watson. He often touched it like a relic, a tangible reminder of the moment humanity first learned to speak across the void of distance. One evening, a storm swept over the coastline. Lightning flashed across the dark sea, illuminating the telephone wires like threads of silver. Bell stood by the window, completely transfixed. The storm was alive with electricity, the same mysterious power he had spent his life learning to harness. He smiled faintly. "Nature speaks in lightning," he whispered to himself, "and we merely learn to listen." In that brilliant flash of light, he thought of all the inventions that had followed his own. Radio waves flying through clouds, sound etched onto records, images traveling through air, and even the early experiments in wireless telegraphy that hinted at something far greater still. The future had already begun to sing its next verse, and he was privileged to hear its opening notes. A young engineer once visited him during those final years, his eyes full of ambition. "Mr. Bell," the man said excitedly, "we're experimenting with sending pictures through wires, moving images that speak." Bell's face softened with pride. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then you're teaching the world to see as well as to hear," he said. "Soon, light and voice will travel together, and silence will never rule again." For Bell, technology was never just about machinery. It was about connection. It was about empathy translated into a physical form. "Every invention," he told the engineer, "is a prayer disguised as progress, a way to bring people closer, to soften the immense distance between human hearts." As time passed, his hands grew slower and his breath more measured, but his mind remained a vast constellation of memory and invention. He often dreamed of that first, historic call. He could almost hear Watson's footsteps echoing down the hall. The words, "Come here, I want to see you," still lingering in the air like a sacred echo. Sometimes he would wake and think he could still hear it, traveling endlessly through the wires of time. In his final summer, Bell returned once more to the coast of Nova Scotia. The sky was an immense, pale blue, and the air carried the scent of salt and pine. He stood by the shore, where waves whispered their eternal rhythm against the rocks. Nearby, a telephone line stretched across the cliffs, humming softly, almost like a heartbeat. He smiled, a sense of peace washing over him, and whispered into the wind, "The voice has outlived me." That night, as the stars rose, the world around him shimmered with a quiet, vibrant life. From distant cities, voices crossed through cables. Radio waves drifted silently through the sky. 1,000 words traveled unseen through the night. Bell lay in his bed, the soft murmur of the sea outside his window blending with the faint, ever-present hum of electricity. He closed his eyes and listened, truly listened, one last time. He did not hear silence. He heard connection. He heard every hello that would ever be spoken. Every "I miss you," every "good night," every "I love you." His invention had become more than a device. It had become the language of human longing itself. When morning came, the world felt a little quieter, but not for long. News of his passing spread quickly, carried by telephones ringing across continents. People spoke his name into the very invention he had given them, many unaware that every single word they spoke was a tribute, every call a continuation of his beautiful dream. Years turned into decades, and still, the voice of Alexander Graham Bell whispered through the world he had helped shape. His dream did not end with the wire. It evolved. It became radio, television, satellites, and, eventually, the invisible network of digital voices that now fill our air. The world that once relied on silence now overflowed with connection. Somewhere, in the infinite hum of signals that surround us right now, that first call still lingers. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Those words continue to echo, folded into the frequencies of every call, every message, every whisper that crosses the planet. The sea near his old home still sings against the rocks, and if one listens closely, it hums like an ancient wire, live with unseen voices. The sky carries signals now, the same way the air once carried dreams, and humanity continues to reach across distance, across time, across the great expanse of silence. With one eternal message: we are here, we hear you. And in that endless chorus, somewhere beyond light, beyond sound, beyond silence, the spirit of Alexander Graham Bell listens, still smiling, knowing that his small whisper had become the voice of the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of connection. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. We appreciate you being here.